Hello, 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 hello.
So if I don't get it up, I will just send the slides to you, Athena, afterwards because it really is just going over some of those. Um, I'm not sure why it's doing what it's doing. Yep, I knew this. I even played with it last night and it worked fine on a pretend Zoom call. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'll send these to you afterwards. So first of all, I am Gina Polameni. I currently work at the University of Utah, and Spark was mentioned. I'm the outreach marketing person for Spark. And so some of you may have had me drop off some information and goodies at your offices. And if you haven't, please reach out to me because I can drop them off. And at first, I wasn't sure what Spark was, but now that I'm a grandma of a brand new diagnosed kiddo with autism level 2, I'm starting to understand more and more, even though I have a child on the spectrum. And really, what it is what scares family is it talks about DNA, but it really is it's a spit test, and it's helping to hopefully alleviate those hard things that some of our loved ones experience with autism, such as the seizure disorders, eating, sleeping, on and on. So the other part of my job is I'm a faculty for the Utah Regional Education Leadership Education and Neurodevelopmental Disabilities, and then a volunteer for the Legislative Coalition for People with Disabilities, and that's why I'm here today. So this last legislative session was a really interesting one. It almost felt like we were working in a deficit when we're not, but a lot of the closed door meetings and such that we're used to being very public were not as public as we thought they were supposed to be, and now they'll even be less public after some of the laws passed. But for our population, some of the, I'm going to do this, the good, the at least okay, or at least okay, the it depends, and the ugly of what happened. And so the good, or at least maybe okay, was the base budget, which was for appropriations for social services, which was House Bill 7 passed. And the good part about that, there was lots of things that didn't make it in there. Mental health did not fare well this year, which was very unfortunate because there was a lot of advocacy efforts on that. But at least for the Division of Services for People with Disabilities, they did get 11 million for kind of their base operations and such. And then they got 553 plus million for their community supports waiver. So hopefully bring more individuals off of that long waiting list. They also got to almost 3 million for non-waiver services. And what that is there, I'll talk about it in just a second. There were a bill that helped pass some support services for those on the waiting list that aren't completely into services yet, so they don't get that federal match. So they'll have a way to help pay for some respite and such. And then we did get some respite care amendments, which is great because it now offers DSPD, as I was just saying, to offer some respite care, transportation, community integration, vocational rehabilitation, and day services to some of those individuals on the waiting list for the community supports waiver. So we were really pleased to see that. We also seen that there was a House Bill 468, and it's the student health amendments. And that one it adds that adrenal insufficiency medication to the list of medications that employees at schools can volunteer to administer and enacts provisions about its administration. So that is added to like the medications for seizures and such to stop those seizures. There was also a school prescription amendment, which allows certain healthcare providers to provide a prescription upon request to certain school employees or coaches. And what this does is it's for like an EpiPen or albuterol for those students that may have severe life-threatening allergies or asthma, that they can have the Department of Health and Human Services issue standing prescription drug orders for the EpiPens and albuterol. So that is kind of a comfort for some of those students that have some of those serious allergies and asthma. And then there was a amendment to the caregiver compensation that we got passed last year. And this was House Bill 32. And this just seems like it should have been in there before, but now it allows for a step parent to be compensated for that care. And it still is awaiting for approval from the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, but don't see problems with that, but at least it will help with that ongoing support for families that definitely need that support of the caregiver compensation. So these ones are, it depends. And for Legislative Coalition, we are, nonpartisan, but it's really hard not to be sometimes sarcastic after you spend enough time learning the language and being with all the people, and everybody's there for mostly good reasons. But it's really hard to see some of the things that happen. And so when I talk about some of these, it's coming from a disability advocate standpoint, because there's going to be pros and cons for many of these. But Senate Bill 69, there were income tax amendments that came this year, and in the form of 167.7 million. And it will lower the individual and corporate income tax from 4.65 to 4.55. So as you can see, that's a 10% difference. And so the pro on that, we're all seeing the effects of just trying to make it day to day. So in the legislative authorities, they thought that maybe this will help Utahns remain competitive and help Utahns keep more of their hard-earned money in their pockets to help pay for food, clothing, room, board, all of those things, gas. But on the other hand, where we look at it, since that is such a big chunk of money, it's like, how much does that really affect our bottom line taxes? So that's yet to be seen. So that will make many happy, but it also does take out of that base budget. And then a good part of it was the House Bill 153. There was childcare revisions, and that is in the amount of 2.3 million, and that expands that $1,000 child tax credit. And that will allow now for families to use that credit for children up to age 5. So that will help many of those families with the young kiddos. So I don't see a negative in that one. But then there is House Bill 347, and it's the Educational Rights Amendment. This one's a little bit harder for me to, I can see both sides of it, having a daughter that's a teacher, but it requires the Utah State Board of Education to make rules ensuring a student is educated in the least restrictive environment. And we know that's important, especially for students with disabilities. But unless there is a predictable risk of serious bodily injury to other students or staff, or a significant disruption to the classroom on an ongoing basis, we as advocates have significant concerns that this bill will make it difficult for teachers, schools, the State Board of Education to comply with the state law and federal law, which that's IDEA, leading to a lot of unnecessary litigation to ensure the rights of students with disabilities are protected. So we have talked at length about this with educators, with the Council for Exceptional Children, disability advocates. And yes, we can see when if you are on the other side of it, you want to make sure that your student isn't in harm's way. So there needs to be measures put in place to keep everybody safe, but still not segregate the child that may just need more supports. The one that's really getting to us is the disruption in the classroom. That one's a little harder to swallow because we know that especially kids with behavioral issues, autism and such, they may be seen as disruptive. And so we're seeing that, there is IDEA, and this will cost taxpayers a lot of money in litigation if this goes on and a parent does have the rights to have that child in the least restrictive environment. So we'll see how this plays out. Again, we can see both sides. We need more support for teachers, especially in those classrooms that need the extra supports. Because I asked my daughter and she said, 90% of my kids have behaviors. And she said, I don't want them out of my classroom. I just want the support to be able to make sure that all my kids in my class are getting what they need. And then there is the House Bill 84, and that is the school safety amendments. Many people are on both sides of this. It really has a lot to it about having pretty much armed guards at every school, having lock boxes. Again, safety is the big piece of this and why it passed, but there are a lot of worries about how this will be implemented, how it will truly protect children and the access for parents to get to their children. So there's a lot of things that I think will come out of this one and see how it all plays out. And then along with that, House Bill 119, the school employee firearm possession amendments. Again, pros and cons, and it depends on, the personal preference, but it creates the educator protector program to incentivize school teachers to responsibly carry and secure a firearm on school grounds. So there's, again, a lot of controversy on both of these from the disability advocacy groups, because we do know many students that end up getting shot or killed, unfortunately, they have disabilities. So want to just make sure that if they're putting all these protections in place, that they're truly protecting all children, including those with disabilities that, with mental illness, severe behavior. So the ugly, and when I say these, some of them are because they failed or because they passed. But House Bill 137, which was the disability coverage amendments, it failed, unfortunately. And that one it would allow a person with a disability income up to 500% of the federal poverty level and 125,000 or less in assets to pay Medicaid a sliding scale fee. So they'd still be paying for some of their health insurance or premiums not covered by their private insurance, because this could make it easier for all individuals with disabilities who need Medicaid because of their health care needs and such, but want to work and they actually want to make a living wage. And it could also make a difference for those parents that, if you're qualifying for Medicaid while you're waiting on a waiting list for a Medicaid waiver, it would allow families to earn a little bit more to get their children the coverage that they need for their special health care needs. But unfortunately, that did not pass. There's also the federal funds contingency planning, and that one did pass. That's House Bill 59. And like I said, I'll send all of these, and they're very easy to look up on the resources I have listed, as well as the legislative website. But this plan, which really affects agencies and departments such as Eric's. It's just going to cost so much headache. But for every request over 2 million or 10% of an agency's total budget in federal funds, it requires that that agency submit an analysis of how it would respond to a reduction in or loss of the money. Also requires an agency to update its overall contingency plan every 2 years, unless its requests total more than 10 million, in which case it must do so every year. It will make it harder for programs like Medicaid to adapt and meet the needs of the most vulnerable children with disabilities and force government to be less efficient and cost effective. This one, again, it passed. We're sad about that because unfortunately this just causes more paperwork. It makes it so competitive grants that some of the programs want to apply for. More people are working through red tape versus actually being able to do the jobs that they want to do by helping children and families. So that's my sarcastic part of it. There is the House Bill 463, the Medicaid program amendments. This one failed, and I will say thank goodness. I would do a happy dance for you on the screen, but you don't want to see that. This one, I'm very happy about that it fell. It will come back. Unfortunately, this is not the first time we have had to fight something like this. There's a lot of new legislators in that do not understand the importance of Medicaid for individuals with disabilities or special health care needs. This one would be if Medicaid experiences a shortfall for any reason, among other possible steps, requires that the program would cut services or close enrollment. In addition to the harm Medicaid beneficiaries, the proposal would be damaging to both the providers and the program's infrastructure. What people usually don't understand is that when they want to cut Medicaid, they go after, the services that are not in the state plan, and people think that they are, such as OT, PT, nursing. All of those would be cut automatically, and that would have big implications for most of our Medicaid waiver programs. And again, they would even do provider cutbacks and such. And we already know providers work on very little of what Medicaid reimburses. So this year, just as happy as could be that they did, that one did fail, but it will resurface in many different forms over the next few years. House Bill 197, we're really sad that it failed. It was the requirements for supported decision-making agreements. And this bill would have addressed the supported decision-making agreements and guardianships, and it would amend the provisions concerning the rights of certain individuals who are under a court-ordered guardianship. It had a lot of good stuff in there. We want individuals with disabilities to be as independent as possible. This would help with not having full guardianship, but they would still have help making some of those very important decisions in financial and medical matters. But unfortunately, it did fail, and hopefully it will come back the next year. And so that we can further get the language right, I guess. The last one I'm going to talk about is House Bill 197, and that was the services for people with disabilities. This one was from one of our champions, Jen Daly Provost. It did fail. I thought was one of those bills that, yes, it carried a large price tag, but in the end, if it played out the way she would want it, is that it would create a services for people with disabilities perpetual trust fund to pay for services for people on the waiting list for DSPD, and it exempts people with disabilities perpetual trust fund from the State Money Management Act. And that one is where they can take and pull when needed from other places. It did carry a $400 million price tag, but the way she had it laid out, it would eventually start funding itself, because We know that the legislators every year get bogged down with what are we going to do with the waiting list? And for some of us that need some of those other Medicaid waivers, such as the technology dependent waiver and the medically complex waiver, unfortunately, those are not even talked about in all of these because the population on the waiting list is so huge that they just think that it's this ever-growing black hole, which that's what been saying is like we can't control the amount of people with disabilities. It's a natural progression of life, whether it's through birth, accident, aging, whatever it is. So no, it's never going to get smaller. We need to, instead of thinking that we did a good job this year by maybe taking 100 people off the waiting list, how are we going to support people with disabilities, not just on DSPD, but on all, Medicaid waivers and such. So I think now that has been introduced, even though it failed, it opens up a great opportunity for advocates, families, and all the people that care about them, professional partners, to have those conversations to say we need to meet these needs because, as you said, as people are going in to your offices and such, it really is hard when you're saying here's the resources, and of course number one resource is parent center and of course family voices, but when there's waiting lists and there's just all of these hurdles to just get even basic services, not even some of the extensive services, it gets a little bit depressing. So we will continue to update and such, and there are a few resources that have tracking of the bills and such. Even you can look at them now because there's a lot I didn't mention. Disability Law Center, and I'll just say Legislative Coalition for People with Disabilities. You can see what all of us are working on together. And we have different places where we put our efforts, but we all work together to try to make sure that legislation passes in the best interest for all individuals with disabilities and special health care needs. So thank you.
Thank you, Gina. That was so great to hear all those updates, and you made aware of ones that we might want to keep an eye out for the next legislative session as well. I'm sure some of you have questions for Gina. I'm going to ask you to put them in the chat if you do, just because we are running a little over today and I want to make sure Joel gets enough time. So again, if you have questions, go ahead and stick them in the chat for Gina. And then I'm going to turn the time over to Joel now, who is our presenter today. He is a provider that has specialized in pediatric OT services for his whole career. And I had the pleasure of working with him when I worked at UDAC and got to see a lot of the work that he did there. But he's worked in outpatient rehabilitation, schools, early intervention settings, and community healthcare settings as well. So we're very excited to have Joel here with us today to talk about sensory integration disorders. And Joel, I'll go ahead and turn the time over to you.
Great, thank you. And it's fun to see a lot of familiar faces here, people that I currently work with or have worked with in the past. So that's really enjoyable. I want to start today. I also hope that this can be fairly interactive. If you guys have questions as we're going, feel free to put them in the chat or to even speak up. I'll do a quick overview of sensory processing just in general, and then we'll talk about, try to spend most of our time kind of talking about children, how it presents in behaviorally in a bunch of children and what to do about it. So that's my goal for how I think we will try to work through this. Let's see. When we think about our five senses, or our traditional five senses, hearing, vision, taste, smell, touch, those are really how we get feedback about what's happening with our body in relation to the environment around it. So with that, we understand that pretty well. I think most people have an understanding of our basic five senses. But when we're learning about sensory processing, very often we talk about three additional senses that we have that influence our ability to understand what's happening with our body itself, in addition to just how we relate to the environment or the world around us. Those additional senses, one of them is called proprioception. Proprioception is body awareness that is received through receptors in our muscles and joints. So when we use our sensory processing abilities to generate good awareness of what's happening physically with our body, that comes through body movement. Deep pressure can be anything, when you think about kids, a lot of the kids we work with who are on the spectrum that I'm seeing have any variety of behaviors that include sensory seeking through physical stimulation. So that's the first internal sense, is that proprioception. The second one is your vestibular sense. Your vestibular sense really gives you feedback about what's happening with your head position in relation to gravity. So head movement, anywhere that your head moves, it's getting stimulation from receptors in your inner ear that give you that feedback and help you with head position awareness. So those two, proprioception and vestibular input, are really key aspects, because when we talk about interventions for how to help children with sensory processing difficulties, those are the areas that we tend to see the greatest benefit for providing additional stimulation. We'll get more to that in a few minutes. The third internal sense is called interoception, and that has to do with interpretation or awareness of internal body function feedback. So these are things like the sense of having a full bladder that tells you have to use the bathroom, or perhaps you're feeling that your stomach is upset and you might be sick, or even hunger cues or toileting cues. Those are in interoception feedbacks that we get that give us feedback. It's a third internal sense that we rely upon for good control. To really understand our sensory system and how it works, we have a variety. Every sense has its own set of receptors. So our touch receptors are located in our skin and in our hair follicles. Obviously our hearing receptors, ears, etc. We're pretty aware of all those other receptors. When we're talking about sensory processing and how that affects the kids we work with, really what we're thinking about is how your brain is interpreting that stimulation. So we get feedback into our brain from our receptors. Our receptors are like on and off switches. They don't do the processing on the receptor level. So for example, we'll use touch processing as our example. Our touch receptors constantly receive every bit of touch input that is available to it. Every bit of touch that happens to our skin, that input is sent to our brain. The receptors receive that input and send it to our brain. And our brain is responsible for filtering it out or deciding whether that input is important or relevant for it to be able to be aware of on an ongoing basis. So when that filtering process is working well, we really only pay attention to the things that are most relevant or most meaningful. For example, our clothes touch our body all day, and those touch receptors continue to receive that input and send that input to our brain. But our brain's ability to process that input is the determining factor of how impacted we are by it. We should filter out our touch from our clothing because that's there all day. We don't really rely upon that for ongoing feedback that's important. So we should filter that out. What happens in children with sensory processing disorders is that there's interruptions to their ability to process that input well. Meaning that they're getting either too much input because the filtering is not happening adequately. So they're being overwhelmed with sensory stimulation that they have to actively process. Or it could be that they're not getting enough sensory feedback because the filtering is happening too strongly. So they may feel like they're not getting enough value out of routine sensory experiences. So that leads us to kind of the two most recognizable patterns of sensory processing disorders. On the one hand, so if you can imagine that there's a range of normal sensory processing, The upper aspect of that range, the upper threshold, is some level of tolerance. So if your baseline is over level of tolerance, that means that you might be experiencing things as overstimulating. This would relate to having a sensory filter in your brain that is not filtering out enough input. You're being bombarded with too much information to try to actively process, and you tend to get overstimulated. So that's the one end, is overstimulation. Behaviorally, what we see with kids who are overstimulated is that they, in many ways try to avoid the stimulation that they know to be overstimulating. If it's sounds, they might cover their ears. They might make repetitive noises on their own as a way of drowning out the sounds that are coming. If it's touch or tactile input, these are kids that might become picky eaters based on food textures. They might be very particular about like super sensitive activities like haircuts or fingernail trimming, or even what clothing they wear based on the fabrics or the seams in their clothes. So that's the pattern we might see with overstimulation. More of being overwhelmed by experiences, perhaps a lot more avoiding of input. On the other end, we can be understimulated and have a decreased awareness of sensory input, and that might lead a child to become a sensory seeker. If a child is a sensory seeker, they might be seeking out stimulation to try to give themselves feedback and increase their awareness through additional input. So with those two kind of extremes in mind, I think it's helpful. Great question, Abby. Yes, and I'm going to touch on that if you give me 1 minute, okay? Abby asked a question, can there be both overstimulation and understimulation at the same time? And yes, absolutely. And I was just going to say, it's in the rare case that I see a child that I would say is a true sensory seeker or a true, like, unique child that's overstimulated. It happens, but it's not as common. A true sensory seeker will crave more of everything. All kinds of input's good. The most that they can get out of everything. They want more touch, they want more sound, they want more smell, they want more, heavy impact from movement, everything. They want more. Whereas, and likewise with kids who are overstimulated, that if that's truly the dominant pattern and there doesn't seem to be any associated seeking, they're just bothered by everything. But that's not the most common pattern. What I would say I see most commonly are kids that have some degree of both. And it usually follows, their behavioral pattern follows the amount of perceived control over which the child has over the stimulation. So sensory stimulations that come at a child that they have less control over, that are things that are imposed upon them, like sounds, like a lot of touch, it can be most of our external senses. It can be smells, it can be tastes or flavors, or oral sensory with textures, etc. But that input that comes at you that you have less control over, those are the things you're going to tend to react negatively to, because you feel like you have harder time interpreting how that feedback, what the nature of that feedback is. While at the same time, kids will tend to seek out stimulation in the areas in which they can control the input. Usually that equates to those internal senses like proprioception and vestibular input, or movement. So we have a lot of kids who will seek out, they're very active sensory seekers through physical stimulation. These might also include, and very commonly includes, things like repetitive movement patterns. So it could be, like from a vestibular standpoint, it could be rocking, it could be spinning, it could be being upside down. From a physical standpoint, these might be kids who really crave lots of jumping, running, climbing, banging, pounding, kind of heavy physical stimulation into those proprioception receptors in their muscles and joints. And they're doing that as a way of trying to get themselves some regulation, trying to feed themselves sensory feedback that allows them to get regulated. Does that answer your question, Abby? Okay. So as I'm working with kids, what we're looking for is trying to determine what their sensory pattern is. What's the dominant pattern? It's also important to think about how which, like, if a child is overly sensitive, they're going to be most sensitive in the areas where there's the greatest concentration of receptors. That's why I can ask families very often, like, pointed questions about particular things their child might respond negatively to, like haircuts or fingernail trimming, or because those are areas where we have a greater concentration of touch receptors on our head, on our hands, on our feet. And you might say, and the parents are like, wow, how did you know that? Well, it's because these are common patterns. If you're going to be oversensitive, you are typically extra sensitive in the areas where the input is most intense, or where you have the most receptors, the greatest concentration of receptors. So those are really common patterns. But similarly, for kids who are sensory seeking, they might seek out stimulation in those areas where there's more receptors. That's why we see a lot of kids with oral sensory seeking patterns. They putting things in their mouth, chewing on things, because they can give themselves input orally. Or a lot of kids that I see who are always carrying around something. They always have something in their hands. They want that stimulation of touch input that they can control all the time. Similarly, when we look at that, we want to consider, how can we support parents and give them ideas? Because I think the first step is recognizing that these sensory behaviors that children have often are meeting a need. It may not be efficient and it may not be appropriate, but it is providing that child's sensory seeking usually is providing them with input that is valuable to them, or else they would not persist in engaging with those activities. So when we work with families and we're trying to help them, direct them for what to do about their child's sensory needs, we try to help them develop ways to give more directed sensory stimulation to their child, or help their child seek it out on their own in ways that's appropriate and effective. The term that we call a sensory program, a daily sensory routine for kids, we call it a sensory diet. And that's just a term and a standard term that we use for developing a sensory program for a child. Sensory diet is obviously not a food diet. It's a daily diet of sensory experiences designed to provide them with feedback that helps them improve their processing. Most often, this includes looking at what a child's behaviors are, because that we can follow their lead. Usually the child's behaviors will indicate what they feel like is most effective in giving them feedback that is that feels good to them and is helpful. And this is going to vary depending on the age of the child, obviously. If we have an older child, then we can do a lot of directing them or giving them choices for options that they can choose and engage with on their own. If we have a younger child, then we're going to have to be more directed in providing the stimulation for them. But when we develop sensory diet, very often the activities that have the biggest impact include those things that change your internal processing, like proprioception, or that deep pressure or stimulation into muscles and joints, and vestibular input, or head movement kind of stimulation. That's why on the proprioception side, that's why you see so many products out there in the market available, like things like weighted vests or weighted blankets, because weight is one way to provide deep pressure input. It's stimulation into those muscles and joints. There are also other programs, like there's a therapeutic brushing program, also known as the Wilbarger protocol. That's a common treatment that uses these little surgical scrubbing brushes, and it involves giving deep pressure brushing over your skin of your arms, back, and legs, and is often done with joint compressions to the same areas, arms, back, and legs. That's another fairly well researched and common way of providing deep pressure input. But it's also really important when we're developing sensory diet programs to try and find things that are really practical for families. This is one of my, if I had a personal, gosh, one of those things that just is really important to me is finding things that are really practical for families. Families have to be able to provide the daily sensory stimulation for their child. And I've worked in all kinds of environments, and I've worked in places that had really super cool sensory gyms, right? And in a way, sometimes it's disheartening for parents when they come in and they see their child like do all these cool activities in a sensory gym, and there's no way they can replicate it at home. They can't get that same kind of stimulation on a daily basis at home. So it's really fun. It's fun to see the child do well and respond, but it's not real practical. So I'm always looking for ways to help families think of what's like a super simple way. For example, it could just be that roughhouse play is the main thing that child responds to as a way of providing deep pressure or proprioception. It could be that when that child gets out of the tub every day, if it's a younger child, that instead of just drying them off, we vigorously dry them off or wrap the towel around them and squeeze them super tight. It doesn't have to be, these don't have to be really fancy or complex ways of providing stimulation. It can be really daily, routine, practical strategies. And that's what I look for to try and help parents engage with. When I am building a sensory diet for a child, I often compare it for the family with a regular food diet. And I think this is really valuable. Children with sensory processing needs, this is not just, I'll often have parents that say like, oh, I just need to help my child get their wiggles out. And I think, okay, it's not exactly the same. This is a deep-seated need for sensory stimulation to achieve basic regulation. Just to get a status that is regulated and able to engage and attend and function, these are kids that require sensory stimulation. They're processing, so it's much more than just getting their wiggles out. And comparing it to a food diet, an eating diet, I want to help families like recognize if your child is hungry and they come to you and they express their hunger, you feed them. And when your child has eaten, that meets that need for a period of time, and they don't need to eat again for a while, but they're going to eat again later. And routinely, you just feed them until they are hungry again, and you just do this as a routine. It's what we do. Kids with sensory needs require stimulation in the same way. When we provide the sensory input for them, we give them stimulation that meets those needs. It meets those needs for a period of time, and you're going to have to come back and do it again later. There's a routine and or a pattern of providing input that can help a child improve their regulation over time, keep their regulation on an ongoing basis more steady, more able to engage and focus. With that, what I often see from families is like if you have a child who is a big sensory seeker or even struggles with processing sensory input, and your primary idea is like this is interrupting function. I want my child to be able to, sit at the dinner table for 20 minutes. But if my child feels compelled to seek out stimulation and they can't sit for that long, that's problematic. That interrupts their ability to engage with that task. It may be tempting just to say, like, I need you to sit, just sit. In other words, you're taking a child who has a sensory need and saying, don't do it. Like we're just trying to change the behavior without changing the underlying sensory need that's driving the behavior. So that big switch in mindset is to understand, rather than just removing the opportunity for the stimulation, we want to replace it with something of greater value, something that's more appropriate and effective. We wouldn't take a child if a child came to us and said, "I'm hungry," we wouldn't say, "Okay, but don't eat." And we know what the result of that would be. So if we have a child that is sensory seeking or has patterns of behavior that are giving them sensory feedback that's valuable to them, and we just redirect the behavior without providing some additional sensory support to replace that need, then it's a detriment to them. And then we're going to cause, most likely, an increased need in seeking out the stimulation. So from a functional standpoint, I really want to impress upon you guys, and as we can pass this on to families, those behaviors meet a need. What we're trying to do is provide sensory stimulation that meets those needs more efficiently and more appropriately, and eliminates that child's need, or diminishes at least that child's need, to seek it out on their own, or to engage in sensory behaviors that are less adaptive or less functional, by us providing the right kinds of sensory stimulation. Now, the specifics of families can go online. If you Googled sensory diet ideas or sensory diet recommendations, they can get lists and lists online of activities that they might consider. I'm not able, probably it's such a big range of possible sensory patterns. It's hard for me on a day like today to say, oh, here are the handful of activities that always work best to provide kids with sensory input, because it has to be tailored a little bit more particularly to each child. But if we understand that we can find sensory strategies to give input to children, then we can make a big difference in the parents being able to recognize and know how to think about meeting their child's needs. I just barreled through a whole bunch of information in a really short period of time. So looks like there's a question from Elizabeth, and I'll answer that real quick. But then I want to just open it up for a question and answer for the last 10 minutes or so, because hopefully you guys, as I've talked to Mile a minute here for a minute, hopefully you guys have other questions that have popped up. Elizabeth asked, might these kids grow into teens that have risky behaviors searching stimulus, such as driving fast, free climbing, etc.? Absolutely. If a child craves sensory input and seeks out stimulation, we as humans, we're pretty proficient at finding ways to meet those sensory needs. So I see a lot of these kids develop into risk takers that maybe have it. And here's the other thing that happens behaviorally a lot. I see a lot of kids who have sensory needs. And I'll compare this to like younger children who are just learning, like preschool age children, just learning how to interact with other kids. And if you take a child who has increased sensory needs, the value of that interaction with another child increases when it includes physical contact, because you're getting more sensory feedback out of it than rather just looking at them and talking to them. So a lot of these kids with sensory needs can be identified. You look at them and think, well, that's a very aggressive child. And the other children don't understand that, they have a child with good sensory processing doesn't require the physical contact to make that interaction meaningful. So the sensory kid might be considered more aggressive or more physical, and that's often discouraged. But if we look at that and say it starts at that time, you can look at it in younger ages and say it's disrupting their interactions even at that age, and maybe they engage in more sensory seeking or risk-taking behaviors. And the increased stimulation to them is rewarding. It feels good. So they take a risk, something happens, like even if it should be, we'd look at it and think it might be injurious, could cause injury. It could cause, what we would interpret, we'd look and think that should have hurt. But that child, it's rewarding. It feels good to them to have that sensory input. It gives them feedback that they process well. So absolutely, you can extrapolate that and think as they get older, these are kids that can continue on those paths of risk-taking behaviors and seeking out input that is that can be hard for them, or can create difficulties for them down the line. Does that answer your question, Elizabeth? Great. Any other questions that you guys have thought of? Yeah. Abby, do you often see big changes in sensory needs throughout their life? Yes. And that can happen in a couple ways. And it depends on the cognitive abilities of the child. As children get older, usually in the range of maybe ages 8 to 10, we can start teaching methods for learning how to self-regulate, because developmentally kids in that age range have a greater understanding for understanding their own body and even thinking about their own feelings and how they're reacting to it. So that's called metacognition. As metacognition develops in children, they're able to have a better understanding of their own capacity and more awareness. And then they can they can do things on their own to meet those needs. So two things happen. Number one, we can actually improve our processing. By doing interventions where the child's young, we can change the way the child processes over time. So we can see actual progress in not needing as much sensory stimulation to regulate yourself over time because of the input that's been provided. Our brain has the capacity to remember what it feels like to process normally and then do it again and learn that skill over time. So that's one way, just development of better skills and better processing. Secondly, as we get older, we also get better at meeting our own needs in an appropriate manner. Because I'm going to guess if every one of us thought about what are the sensory behaviors that we do to keep ourselves regulated, and all of us probably have something. Most people rely on some sort of sensory strategy to keep themselves going. Like, silly one, but I often scratch. I'm more of a lower awareness person. I like a lot of sensory stimulation. Like, I love loud music. I like going fast. I like I liked when I was growing up, when my body still allowed this. I like big, heavy physical contact sports. Tackling and anything that gave me a lot. I craved that. That was when I felt most alive, was during that kind of stimulation. But I still do. I still give myself, if I'm in a meeting like this and there's some guy droning on about sensory stuff and I need to maintain my focus, I'm like, Joel, give yourself some feedback, because that's what helps me to stay regulated and kind of alert. But no one else is going to see that. Like, no one else is going to look at me and this looks like I'm got my hands held like this, right? But it's a little behavior I noticed I do and I've done most of my life. So we all have little things that we do in that regard. Chewing is a very common one, because orally we're very sensitive. So, I'm just persistently have mints. I'm a mint eater. And that I like those strong flavored mints. That's another stimulation that I like that helps me stay alert. So I think it's important to normalize this as well, because all of us do it in some regard. All of us have some degree of sensory behavior. And that's great. And like, I think about it, in my own children, I've got a couple kids who are like, they don't sit next to me on the couch when we watch a movie. They want to like meld their body in with mine and be like, and that's fine. That works for me because I like that. But if they try to do that to my wife, who's kind of more of a overstimulated cat, she's like, nope, like too much. So, and they're totally normal kids and people. So we all function on some degree of this. What we're talking about is kids that it's enough of a behavioral pattern that it's disrupting regular routine function. Anything else? Any other thoughts or questions? I'll wrap up with just this thought. If you have any more thoughts, we'll leave a minute at the end. I'll wrap up with this. Families can really problem solve this, but I do recommend, if you have families that need support, it's amazing what a little bit of education can do for a family that that is trying to problem solve, helping their child. So I love getting the opportunity to interact. I work part-time for children with special healthcare needs, or the ISP program, integrated services. I worked for a dozen years for children with special healthcare needs in the past. And floated over to UDAC. That's where I knew Athena, and so I've been around in this network for quite a long time. But I recommend, at any level, if connecting families with their early intervention occupational therapist, a school-based occupational therapist, outpatient occupational therapy, whatever you can, trying to find someone who's got some knowledge, and can help your families as you connect them. Get a little more information and know how to help their child on a daily basis. If you have questions in your in your interactions with families, let us be a resource too. I'm available and I can give direction and support. You can email me, you can call me, you can reach out through the integrated services program, or and say, hey, I've got a child that I think really is sensory, and how can we help them? And whether that's us being involved with them, or whether that's getting them helping get connected with a community resource, I'm happy to do that anytime. So that's all I have to, well, I could go on for a long time, but that's all I have time for. So any other thoughts or questions before we wrap up and let Athena wrap us up? Nope. Thank you, Kyle.
Thank you, Joel, so much. It looks like no other questions came in through the chat, at least. It was really good information, a great overview, and a great way for us to hopefully help families get some of this information too, because I think it's really important for them to know where to go if they're seeing these kind of behaviors. So, and I had down, do you have Children's Ability Services? Is that an agency that people can see you through as well?
Yeah, so I work part-time for and it's JM Manuel, JMMANWILL at utah.gov. That's my email through my job here. But then yes, I have my own agency, is called Children's Ability Services, and that's where I see kids privately and work with them as well. And we have a you can just go to childrensabilityservices.com, a website, and get information there.
Great, thank you so much.
I'm not really here to promote myself. Honestly, I'm here to connect and let family give information, because that's the most valuable thing is there's a lot of great providers. The main thing is get connected with somebody if you have a kid with needs.
Great. Perfect. All right, so in our last 30 seconds here, I just want to encourage people to connect with each other through the listserv or our Facebook group in between our meetings. And then our next meeting will be April 17th. And our topic for that month will be on emergency preparedness, and particularly with a focus for how we can help families and children of youth with special health care needs in the event of a disaster. So we're looking forward to that, and we'll see you all in April. Thank you.